Okay, let's unpack this fundamental head scratcher. Is what we experience as real a truly independent world, existing whether we're here to see it or not? Or is there maybe something more to the picture?
Yeah, it's a big one.
Today, we're diving into some really thought-provoking stuff you sent our way. We've got everything from deep philosophical dives into truth itself to ancient Eastern wisdom, and even that wild idea that maybe our whole reality is just a computer program.
What strikes me immediately is just the sheer range of perspectives here. It's not like one single way of thinking about reality.
Not at all.
It's a whole spectrum, and each one offers a really unique lens on this, well, this age-old question.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive, just for you, is to navigate all this fascinating material and really try to nail down the most compelling ideas about objective reality. Like, does it exist in a way that matters? What could it actually be? Can we even, get our heads around it?
And we know some of these concepts can sound super abstract.
Right. But don't worry, we're going to break them down, try to make them click, and hopefully give you some solid aha moments without feeling like you've just, I don't know, decoded the universe's source code or something.
So to get started, I think it's really crucial we define our terms. What do we actually mean when we talk about subjective versus objective reality? Our Wikiversity source gives a pretty useful starting point for that.
Right. Okay, so subjective reality, as this source explains it, it's basically anything whose existence depends on a mind perceiving it.
Like beauty.
Exactly, like beauty.
Yeah.
Does beauty exist out there independently if no one's experiencing it? Probably not, right?
Wow.
Even the way we see a flower, its shape, its colors, that's all interpreted by our brains. It's a subjective experience.
Okay, and in contrast, objective reality is defined as something that is, well, actual, something that exists independently of any mind.
The example they give is a meteor crashing into a car, causing a fire, even if nobody's around to see it happen.
Right, those events seem like they'd occur regardless of whether someone's watching.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Even with that example, that meteor crash, the source throws in this, fascinating curveball. How can we even describe the meteor, the car, the fire, without using concepts meteor, car, burning, that are themselves understood and interpreted by our minds?
Ah, right. The description itself relies on subjective concepts.
Exactly. It's almost like trying to imagine a shape that has no form until our consciousness gives it one. They compare it to a computer game.
Oh yeah, the unrendered game world analogy.
Yeah, that it just exists as lines of code until it's actually rendered visually on a screen by, well, consciousness in this analogy.
That analogy really highlights the problem, doesn't it? The inherent difficulty in pointing to something as purely objective without leaning on our own subjective framework to even define it.
Totally. Okay, so with those definitions sort of in our toolkit, let's dig into the arguments for the existence of objective reality, again, drawing from Wikiversity. They kick off with a pretty powerful quote from George Orwell.
Ah, the one about totalitarianism.
Yeah, about how totalitarian regimes absolutely need to deny objective truth exists to keep their grip on power.
It's insightful, isn't it? How manipulating political reality links directly to eroding any idea of a shared independent truth. If there's no ground truth outside belief.
Then whoever's in control can just rewrite reality. Scary stuff. Then the source brings up the point that, well, our brains and nervous systems are fundamentally similar. The fact that when two people look at the same thing, they generally describe it similarly.
Yeah.
That's presented as evidence for a single, shared external reality.
So the idea is, while our individual experiences shape our unique internal realities, those realities are mostly responses to a common external source. The consistency in how our brains interpret things, the argument goes, points towards that shared reality we're all bumping up against.
Makes sense. Next up is a more down-to-earth argument. Pragmatic?
The practical one.
Yeah, basically, believing in objective reality is just the most useful, effective way to understand and get around in the world. And, crucially, there's no compelling evidence against it right now.
It's a very sensible approach, philosophically speaking. Stick with what works until something better comes along. But as the objection rightly points out, it's not definitive proof. It's more of a working assumption, a practical stance. A bit like Occam's razor simplest explanation is usually best.
Yeah, an opinion, not proof, as they say. The source also briefly mentions modal realism. That's the mind-bending idea that all possible realities actually exist.
Whoa, okay. And the pro-argument there is?
It's simply that if all possibilities exist, then surely an objective reality must be one of them.
But the objections jump on that pretty quickly. Just because we can conceive of all realities doesn't make them real.
Right, doesn't prove our objective reality exists. And it's a pretty wild theory anyway.
Yeah, suggesting fictional worlds are real too. That's a big leap.
Okay, another pro-argument. We seem to interact with the same world. We can do reproducible experiments, get the same results independently. That points to objective reality, right?
It certainly suggests it strongly, but the objection is quite intriguing. How can we be absolutely sure we're not all just, figments of each other's imaginations?
Or characters in someone else's dream. The Matrix scenario again.
Or like the other objection with color perception, maybe we all agree to call something blue, but my internal experience of blue is totally different from yours. We agree on the label, not necessarily the experience.
That's a classic one. Then we hit Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. Presented as an argument for objective reality because, well, we can at least think about it.
Foundational, yes, but it's got its critics, as the source points out. Like, what about deep sleep? We're not actively thinking then.
Or the point that fictional characters can think in stories, but aren't real.
And another counter is that I think, therefore I am, might be the only objective fact we can know for sure, and only for ourselves. It doesn't necessarily prove anything else out there.
It's kind of limited. There's also a pro-argument suggesting objective reality is conditional on universal truths, encompassing less universal ones. This brings in scientific evidence for non-physical reality and accounts of consciousness outside the body, like NDEs.
Right, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. It even mentions panpsychism and postmodernism briefly there.
So the idea seems to be, if science is finding stuff that isn't strictly physical, and maybe consciousness is more fundamental than matter,
then our everyday objective reality could just be one slice of a bigger, maybe even non-physical objective truth. That's expanding the definition almost.
Okay. And finally, the pro side gives practical, everyday examples. Landing a spaceship on the moon, everyone filling a cup to the same water level, reproducible outcomes.
These definitely underscore the predictability and consistency we see. It strongly suggests an underlying objective reality we can interact with using shared methods, like science.
Okay, so that lays out a pretty good case for objective reality. Now, let's flip it. Let's dig into the challenges, the con arguments, still from Weak University. They start with recent physics experiments. Quantum stuff.
Ah, yes, the quantum weirdness, where reality at the smallest scales doesn't behave like we expect.
Right. The objection brings up non-locality, Bell's theorem, things suggesting connections between distant particles that classical physics just can't explain.
And some interpretations of that challenge the idea of a purely independent, local, objective reality. It implies a deeper interconnectedness.
There's also an objection tied to the Wigner's friend thought experiment and quantum wave function collapse.
Yeah, that raises the possibility that the act of observation itself might be crucial in determining reality at the quantum level. It introduces a kind of subjectivity into unobserved quantum systems.
Which sounds very counterintuitive.
Definitely. But, as the objection also notes, this quantum strangeness doesn't usually pop up in our everyday big-scale world where things seem solid and objective enough.
Good point.
Yeah.
Okay, another con perspective talks about objective reality. Like, feelings are just neurons firing. And subjective reality, objects are just our perceptions being mutually exclusive. You can't have both, apparently.
That seems a bit strong. And the objections push back on that. They argue subjective experiences, even if they come from brain activity, are still part of a larger objective reality.
And just because we can't fully explain subjective experience objectively...
It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The classic absence of proof isn't proof of absence.
Right. Then there's the big one. The unproven nature of objective reality. The Matrix, the dream scenario. How do we know this isn't all just an elaborate illusion?
The objections concede these are, well, not logically impossible, even if they seem unlikely or we lack proof.
And unlikely is subjective anyway, right?
Exactly. And one objection points out, even if we are in a simulation, that simulation itself must exist within some larger, presumably objective reality. The simulator's reality.
Turtles all the way down.
Sort of, yeah. Postmodernism also gets a nod as challenging objective reality.
But the objections clarify that postmodernism often questions our ability to know objective reality more than denying it exists altogether.
Right. It emphasizes that our perception is always filtered through subjective lenses, culture, language, experience, even if there is an objective world out there we're trying to grasp.
Okay, and finally, the con side brings up things like the Statue of Liberty being transient, it won't last forever, and how perception depends on biology. A blind person experiences the statue differently than a sighted person.
The counter-objections say, well, outliers or changing things don't disprove the general rule of an underlying objective reality.
But then there's a counter objection,
Ah, the layers.
raising the issue that relying on majority agreement to define objective reality risks the argumentum ad populum fallacy. Just because lots of people believe something doesn't make it true.
Phew. This back and forth really shows how tangled this whole question is.
It really does. So after all that, the Wikiversity source drops another fascinating idea. Maybe the answer is just unknowable.
Ah, bringing in Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Exactly. The idea that in any complex logical system, there are statements you just can't prove true or false within that system.
And if logic, math, science have these inherent limits,
How can we possibly expect to achieve absolute certainty about the entirety of reality? There might just be parts of the universe forever beyond our grasp, undiscoverable, untestable.
that's definitely a humbling thought.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at some Eastern philosophical views, drawing from the Reddit and Wikipedia sources you sent. The Reddit bit mentions the Buddhist concept of no self in Atman.
Right, the idea that the permanent, unchanging self we usually assume exists actually doesn't. Consciousness is seen more like a flowing stream, a combination of ever-changing elements and experiences.
How does that connect to objective reality?
Well, it challenges the idea of a fixed, independent observer standing apart from a fixed, objective world. If the observer itself is fluid and impermanent, maybe the perceived reality is too.
Interesting. And the Wikipedia source gives a broader view of Indian philosophy orthodox, heterodox schools. Concepts like dharma, karma, samsara, moksha, ahimsa.
Yeah, it's a really rich tapestry. These different schools offer various frameworks for understanding existence, and they don't necessarily map neatly onto a Western objective view.
How so?
Well, for instance, the emphasis in many Eastern traditions on interconnectedness, on the impermanence of all things, that offers a very different lens for seeing what's real, compared to a view focused on distinct, enduring objects.
The Wikipedia source also mentions that Nyaya schools focus on epistemology, how we know things, and their arguments against a creator god, and the Vaisarka school's atomism.
Right, suggesting reality is made of fundamental particles. It just shows the incredible diversity within Indian thought itself, grappling with the building blocks of reality and how we know it, sometimes arriving at very different conclusions.
It also mentions Buddhist modernism, engaging with Western thought, and Sikh philosophy, showing these traditions aren't static.
Absolutely. Philosophical inquiry is always evolving, different traditions engaging with each other, reinterpreting these fundamental questions about existence and reality.
Okay, let's swing back west now and look at the philosophy of mind based on that overview. It starts with Cartesian dualism being dominant historically, the whole mind-body separation thing.
Yeah, Descartes' idea of an immaterial mind distinct from the material body was hugely influential for centuries. But as the text notes, that interaction problem really became a sticking point.
How could two totally different substances actually affect each other?
Exactly. That challenge was a major factor leading to movements like behaviorism, verificationism, and scientific reductionism. They were all trying to find alternatives to dualism.
And they did that by focusing on what? Observable behavior.
Pretty much. Or trying to reduce mental phenomena to physical explanations, ultimately down to physics. They essentially tried to sideline the subjective mind as something unscientific, something you couldn't really study directly.
The overview also brings up Wittgenstein and his argument against a private language.
Right. His point that meaning is fundamentally social. For a word or concept to mean anything, there has to be a shared public understanding of how it's used.
And applying that to mind.
It suggests our understanding of mind comes from its observable effects, its expressions, our shared interpretations, rather than some purely private, internal realm nobody else can access.
Then we get the Turing test and functionalism, defining mental stuff by what it does, not what it's made of.
Yeah, functionalism is interesting. It says what makes something a mind isn't the specific physical stuff, but the functions it performs, processing inputs, generating outputs. Putnam's hydrocarbon chauvinism.
Huh. Right. The idea that minds don't have to be carbon-based brains. They could theoretically be realized in silicon, or who knows what else.
Then there's neurological reductionism or eliminative materialism. People like the Churchlands taking a really radical stance.
That's the one where they basically say our everyday talk about beliefs and desires is just wrong. Folk psychology.
Pretty much. They argue it'll eventually be replaced entirely by the precise language of neuroscience once we understand the brain well enough. Our current terms will seem as outdated as, like, phlogiston.
Wow, okay. What about supervenience? Davidson, Kim.
Supervenience suggests mental phenomena depend on and are determined by brain activity, but they don't have independent causal power themselves.
So my thoughts are real, but they don't cause anything on their own. They're just byproducts.
Kind of like wetness being a property of water molecules. It's always there when the molecules are arranged right, but the wetness itself doesn't cause the molecules to act. It's an emergent property.
Contrasting that is naturalistic dualism, David Chalmers, and the hard problem of consciousness.
Right. Chalmers argues science can explain the easy problems, how brains process info, react, function. But the hard problem is why any of that physical activity is accompanied by subjective experience. Why does it feel like something to see red?
And he proposes.
A kind of dualism where consciousness depends on the physical but isn't reducible to it. It's a fundamental property alongside physical properties.
Then there's the extended mind theory. Otto and his notebook.
Yeah, Clark and Chalmers, again, arguing our cognitive processes aren't just confined to our skulls. The tools we rely on, like Otto's notebook for memory, can actually become part of our cognitive system. Blurs the line between mind and world.
And finally, the overview touches on panpsychism again.
The idea that consciousness, in some basic form, might be a fundamental property of reality itself, present everywhere, in everything to some degree, not just in complex brains.
Okay, that's a whirlwind tour of philosophy of mind. Now let's switch to the Dirge Park source. This one zooms in on the simulation hypothesis and how it relates to theism, belief in God.
Right, the simulation hypothesis, the idea we might be living in a sophisticated computer simulation run by a more advanced civilization. Nick Bostrom's argument is mentioned.
Based on statistics, right. If advanced civilizations can make simulations and do make lots of them,
then it's statistically more likely we're in a simulation than in the original base reality.
And the article explores the potential clash with traditional theism. If some other beings created our simulated universe, where does God fit in?
Does it make life meaningless? The article argues, no, not necessarily. It brings up Plato's cave allegory.
And Chalmers' simulation realism. Even simulated things can be real within the simulation.
Right. The experiences, the relationships, the challenges can all be perfectly meaningful within that simulated context.
What about the idea of multiple simulations? Does that cause problems for theism?
The article suggests not inherently. Even if there are countless simulations, that doesn't rule out a fundamental creator, a God who started the whole process, who created the simulators, perhaps.
It even floats the idea that a divine creator might choose to create multiple universes, simulated or not, maybe out of sheer power or creativity, the principle of plenitude.
Though it also acknowledges we can't really know God's purposes in creating, whether it's one universe or billions of simulations. That remains a mystery.
So the bottom line from that source seems to be, even if the simulation hypothesis is true,
it doesn't necessarily contradict theism. It might just shift our understanding of the cosmos's structure. God could still be the ultimate originator, even if our immediate reality is simulated.
Fascinating. Okay, moving on. The Wikipedia source on subjectivity and objectivity gives us a historical sweep. Back to ancient Greece, Plato's objectivism versus the sophists' relativism.
Yeah, Plato really emphasized objective truth, using math as a model, distinguishing the messy sensory world from a higher realm of perfect forms. That set a course for a lot of Western thought.
And then the focus on subjectivity really ramped up with Enlightenment figures like Descartes and Kant.
Definitely. They dug deep into how the individual mind shapes our perception, raising those key questions about whether we can ever access reality independently of our own experience.
The source also mentions phenomenology Husserl, Sartre focusing on consciousness and direct experience.
Right. Phenomenology brackets assumptions about an external world and focuses purely on the lived experience, the world as it appears to us. Very subjective focus.
Interestingly, it also talks about objectivity challenges in historiography. Trio's Historicity 1 and 2.
Yeah, Historicity 1 being what actually happened, and Historicity 2 being the stories we tell about what happened.
Highlighting that writing history is never purely objective.
Exactly. Power, sources, perspectives, they all shape the narrative. History is interpretation, not just a recording.
And subjectivity in social sciences is seen as socially constructed, interactive.
Right. Our subjective realities aren't just individual, they're shaped by our culture, our interactions. We build them together in a way.
Okay, now for a bit of a critical take. The Eon Essays piece. It questions physics' long quest for a single, hidden, fundamental reality.
Yeah, the author argues that despite amazing successes, physics hasn't actually delivered a final theory and is getting increasingly speculative. with less chance for empirical proof.
It mentions a sort of anxiety in fundamental physics, lack of big breakthroughs despite huge investments.
Hmm. And the author pushes for a more pluralistic view, maybe inviting insights from other fields, questioning if physics should have exclusive ownership of explaining ultimate reality.
The dark matter example is used, right? You can
Mhm.
describe its effects mathematically.
Without really knowing what it is fundamentally. The essay suggests physics' claim to the deepest truth might be partly based on its own narratives, not just pure empirical results.
And it points to stagnation in cosmology, high-energy physics, despite big projects like the LHC. Mentions post-empirical physics.
Yeah, relying more on speculation, mathematical elegance, rather than testable predictions. The piece basically suggests maybe physics needs less focus on one hidden reality and more openness.
A really thought-provoking critique of where science might be heading, or perhaps getting stuck.
It definitely encourages us to think about the limits of scientific inquiry and value other ways of knowing, too.
Okay, finally, the Philosophy Now source adds a few more reflections. Contrasting introspection or revelation with empirical science as ways to access reality.
Highlighting the different paths humans have taken, looking inward, looking outward.
It includes that funny, memorable bit about the man on a flaming pie.
Ah, yes. A great illustration of why unquestioned subjective experience can be, well, unreliable. The need for critical thinking.
It also argues against reality being purely relative to belief, stressing the need for an independent reality. It dismisses solipsism.
By pointing out, again, that language and thought are social. For them to work, for us to even think coherently or communicate, there has to be some shared world we're engaging with.
Even if we interpret it differently.
Exactly. And it ends by just touching on the sheer diversity of views on reality, from Bishop Berkeley's idealist philosophy to other varied perspectives.
It really shows the massive range of human thought on this.
Absolutely. It's an enduring mystery.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really covered a lot of ground. That constant tension between our subjective inner world and the elusive objective reality out there.
Mm-hmm. We've seen the scientific drive for fundamental truths rubbing up against philosophical questions about what those truths even mean.
And we've touched on mind-bending possibilities,
Mm.
like the simulation hypothesis.
And what really stands out, I think, is that none of these sources give us a single, easy answer. There's no neat conclusion here.
Definitely not.
Instead, we get this rich, complex tapestry of ideas, different perspectives, different arguments. It really invites you, the listener, to engage with it all and start forming your own understanding.
And that really leads us to our final thought for you. After considering all these angles, the arguments for objective truth, the fluidity of Eastern views, the simulation idea, the limits of knowing, what does your understanding of reality look like now?
How do you navigate that interplay between your inner experience and the world you perceive outside?
And maybe ask yourself, is chasing one single objective truth the only way, or even the most valuable way, to explore the richness and strangeness of existence? Something to definitely keep pondering.